Good morning. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with you today at ReactNext 2023. What a big room. There's so many of you, and it's a beautiful sight from here. It was well worth the 5-ish hour flight from Germany. My name is Tejas. That's pronounced like contagious. I couldn't say that for the past 3 years. But now I can. And it's just to help you kind of understand how to pronounce my name. And I'm a developer relations consultant. I help companies have good relationships with developers. What that means is either in the past, present, or future, I work with companies that focus on developers primarily and help them just have a nice relationship and also teach and educate and empower, etc. If you'd like to know more about DevRel, come see me. I'll be around today and tomorrow. But that's not the point of the talk, right? The point of the talk today is to explore why everyone needs to use a framework. That's what we're going to talk about. And really, I want to start by sharing the inspiration for this talk. Where does this come from? This talk and understanding why everyone needs to use a framework comes from the pattern, the trend that React is going in today. And I think it's important as a keynote because it literally speaks to the future direction of React. Specifically, it addresses this tweet from Andrew Clark on the React core team at Vercel. He says this, he says, if you use React, you should be using a React framework. If your existing app doesn't use a framework, you should incrementally migrate to one. If you're creating a new React project, you should use a framework from the beginning. This is a very clear directive, right? You should use a framework. You should use a framework. Now, I'm the kind of person who, when you tell me I should do X, should do Y, my first question, almost reflexively, is, okay, but why? Why? And so for me, I'm happy to use React or Vue or whatever it is, but I need to understand the underlying mechanism. And I feel like for us as engineers, it's important that we understand the underlying mechanism. Ideally, we should be able to create our own framework from scratch and fully understand it. And then, of course, it's good to lean on the shoulders of giants. It's good to use what the experts create. But it's important for us as engineers, I feel, to understand it so that when something goes wrong, or if we decide we need to fork it and do our own thing, we know. We have the knowledge, we have the education, and we're capable, we're empowered, okay? That's the motivation for this talk. So before we begin, I'd like to talk about what even is a framework. So the front end, the React ecosystem, has a number of terms that we kind of use interchangeably and get into some debates about, which I think we need to settle for the intents and purposes of this talk. Indeed, the point of what is a framework, I feel like is approaching a little bit of a barbed wire topic, because on Twitter and social media, you see people get into these like vicious debates. React is not a framework, React's a library. No, it's a framework. No, there's meta framework. And so we've got these terms, library, framework, meta framework, but what's what? What I'm doing is defining them for the intents and purposes of this talk, and I think they make sense really in a broader context, but I'm not God. I can't speak to like the broader context. But for this talk, a library is a collection of code, so a collection of text similar to like a traditional library of books. It's a collection of code that exports functions that help you do a task. That's what a library is. It just exports stuff and it says use this however you want, I don't care, exports functions. Some examples of libraries, you can think of datefns, date functions, for example, Lodash, Moment.js, right? They just export functions and they're like, good luck. Similarly, React exports, most famously, react.createElement. It's a function, good luck, create React elements. What is then a framework? A framework can exist either at the programming language level, so PHP has a framework called Symfony, Ruby has Rails, or it can wrap a library to give you more conventions and opinions. So a framework literally gives you a frame within which you can do work, right? And so a framework is something that takes maybe a library or programming language and gives you more conventions and has stronger opinions such that you don't have to spend your time making decisions. It's made for you. You just go build your thing. Okay? That's the distinction, library and framework. So examples of frameworks would be Next.js as the framework where React is the library. So did my laptop go to sleep? Solid Start is the framework and Solid.js is the library, etc. Then the question becomes, what is a meta framework? And if we understand the language meta means about. So it's a framework about a framework. And I think meta framework, the terminology doesn't really make sense in this context because Next.js is a meta framework for React if React is a framework. But React's a library. It exports a bunch of functions and says good luck, right? So the term meta framework doesn't really apply in this context. So we have libraries that export some functions that you just do whatever you want with, and frameworks that gives you conventions and opinions about those functions. How do you structure your code? Do you need the pages directory, the app directory, or whatever? That's the mechanism we're working with, okay? The next question I'd like to explore, this is just kind of laying the groundwork for our work together, is what do frameworks do, actually? Why should everybody use a framework? So what do they do? And they bring in conventions and have opinions to guide you, but across the board, this is even outside the React ecosystem, frameworks do a bunch of things for us that is a little bit hard to wire up. Specifically, they do server-side rendering, which is very powerful, right? It helps with search engine optimization. It helps with performance optimization. If you stream things to your users, that is UI. What ends up happening, there's a baby in the audience. I love it. I love it. Give it up for the baby, everybody. It's going to be a Next.js developer one day. I'm so proud I get to influence this. So server-side rendering helps you ship things faster and better. Number two, routing. Routing is important to do with a framework because if you just do a typical client-side application, what you're going to be doing is serving your users probably a 404 page. So the server status is 404, and you have your 404 page loads up JavaScript on the client side and continues routing, but from server to client, this contract is wrong, right? They're not getting a 404, and there's some issues there with client only that server routing fixes. Additionally, server-side routing helps you data fetch at the right time in the right place. What does that mean? This is something for you to take away, a practical tool. The best time to start data fetching in a React app, write this down, tweet it, whatever, is as early as possible, generally. You want to start fetching as early as possible at the right time. This is even maybe before you start rendering, right? And in the right place. And what that means is you want to fetch data close to where the data is. You want to fetch data close to the database or close to wherever your cache or whatever. And if you're fetching data on the server that is in a framework, it's more likely that you will fetch the data not from some client's device in the Philippines and your server is in US East, but you fetch data close to where the data is. Servers help you do this. Frameworks help you do this. And of course, frameworks also just take care of all of the edge cases that you would probably miss because they're very large projects built and maintained by hundreds, if not thousands of people that are constantly improving and iterating and getting better, okay? So this is what frameworks do. I've talked a lot about what they do, but I tend to get bored of my own presentations if it's just slides. So let's build one. To understand this, let's build a little framework to see the value that they give us, and then we'll go from there. I have 22 minutes. I may go a little bit over, but whatever. So what do we have? We have a local dev server on the left and a VS Code on the right. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by running npx vite and looking at what we have. So if I reload this, we have a list of dog breeds. Let me zoom in here. You can see a list of dog breeds. And I click on one, and I get a random picture of it. Cute, okay? So if we come here, let's look at the code a little bit. What we have is, it's a classic client application. We create a root, and we render our app in there. What is app? App is a client-side router that on this path renders this component, on this path renders this component, etc. If we dive a little bit deeper into breeds, it's your classic client-side kind of use state, use effect fetching. So we have use state, and we fetch data, and then we set it into state, and then you get it. And it's just a list. That's kind of what you see here, okay? So this is, I'd say, indicative of a very basic client-side application that has some state, fetches data, sets it into state. Now, what we want is the benefits of a framework, specifically server-side rendering. Let's add that. And we can add that by literally just like adding a server. So we'll go here, make a file called server.tsx. And it's a server, so we're going to need Express. We'll import Express. We need React, of course. I mean, and we need this. It's a utility from React server that will render your component to a string. We'll revisit this towards the end. And we need the app. So now what we'll do is we'll create a server just like this. And we'll listen on the root. And we'll render our application. Okay, thank you, Copilot. and we'll listen on port 3000, and we'll say, come on, Copilot, help me out. Perfect. Look at that. AI is going to take over the world. Okay, so we have this. We have server rendering effectively. Let's try and run this and see what happens. I'm going to build it first. So we'll come here and I will node just actually npm run build, and we'll also start the server. And it looks good. Server's listening on port 3000. So on port 5173, I have the client app. On port 3000, I should have the server app, but it says window is not defined, right? Because I'm looking at the Windows path name for my client router. This is already a problem because the server doesn't know what a window is. We can fix this, not a problem. So what we'll do is we'll kill that server, go to our router. It's the thing that routes, and it uses window extensively because it's a client router. This is, again, written from scratch, right? What we want to do is find out where we are. So can we window? Do we have access to window? And this tells us type of window is not undefined, meaning we have window. So if we can window, then we use window. So we'll literally just do this. Otherwise, we need some alternative here, right? And what we need is an initial path from somewhere. This initial path can come from the server or the client. It doesn't matter. It's a string, okay? And we'll use that here. So now we're kind of isomorphic. We're client and server. And indeed, we have to adjust this at the app level. So we'll come to the app level, and we'll say we get an initial path as props, and we'll just pass this down to the router. We're doing a little bit of prop drilling, but it should be okay. Now when we go to our client entry point, app needs an initial path. Since this is the client bundle, we can very clearly say we use window.location.path name, right? But then what do we do on the server side? What do we give it here as the initial path? Well, if we replace the root with any route, and we say the initial path is rec.path. So in both cases, we're telling our router this is where we are. Save, and we restart the dev server, and we should now have it. So it kind of works, except we're not getting data. And we can go to a single breed, like a Bazenji, and we just see that it's loading. And the reason we don't have updates is because there is no React here. If I click this, it says this page doesn't appear to be using React. So we need to insert React somehow. How we do that? We're already kind of referencing the client.js, but we need to tell Express to go use a static directory, dist. This is where our client bundle is. Save that. We'll restart the server. And now, if we go back, we should, great. So this page is now using, oops, do not copy my 2FA. This page is now using the development build of React, and everything kind of follows. Fantastic. But it's not actually fantastic because the data itself is not part of the server response. Like if we view source, what we're getting is nothing. We get some static content, but we don't get all the static content. We don't get the list of dog breeds because we're not fetching data on the server and then serving that to the users. Okay? So what we've implemented just now is, for all intents and purposes, server rendering. And you can tell it's server rendering because I come here and I reload and it still gets it. But it's kind of partial server rendering, and it's like 1/3 of a framework. It's server-side renders, but once data appears, we're kind of lost. We need to close the loop. We need data fetching. Okay, let's look at how we do data fetching in a framework. And this is how frameworks kind of do it, okay? If we want to fetch data, we need somehow to get the data here in the server code. So that means our components that we render need to somehow export their data fetching mechanisms. So if we go to like breeds, right? There's this data fetch that happens inside useEffect. We need to invert control and get this, but like to our server somehow. So logically, if you track, that means we should export this fetch and then import it in the server side and call it, okay? How do we do it? It's not long until we realize, wait, we need file system-based routing. We need to have a directory of pages and then have the local paths become routes. Okay, let's implement file system-based routing. So what we're going to do is make a directory. So we'll do a new folder. We'll call it pages. You may recognize this from Next.js, right? It's kind of how all this works. So what we'll do is we'll take these two files here and move them into pages. Sure. And just to be safe, we'll rename them to be like lowercase so they actually reflect what we would navigate to. We'd take this route and change it to breeds here. And of course, we're kind of importing things wrong. So we'll just adjust our imports, just like that. Okay. So now we've kind of got this, but how do we get it on the server side? How do we make these pages become paths in our server? Well, to do that, we can read from the file system. So we'll say const pages. We should do this asynchronously, but I'm not. But in a proper setup, this would be asynchronous. So we're going to read the directory. So we're going to join the current working directory. So process cwd, and then we'll join that with pages, and we'll read that directory. We'll read that directory, and then we'll map over it and get rid of the extension. We don't want the tsx piece, so we'll split it on dot and just take the first half. Okay? So now we have a list of pages, logically. What can we do with it? Well, we can say pages for each page, literally. It puts us in a position now to get on a route that isn't just a match all, but is that specific page. Okay? And so far, so good. But we somehow now need the right component and a way to fetch the data. This is going to be a problem, right? Because our components have named exports. And it's a little bit hard to predict what to import if the exports are named. So we need default exports. So what we're going to do is instead of const breed, we'll just export default, just like that, right? Just simple. Similarly, we'll come here. We're giving a layer of predictability in our design so that everybody can kind of understand that they need to do a default export, so then our framework can pick up the default export, which is the component, and render it. Going back to the server, we can now import something. So we'll say const mod for module. We'll turn this into an async function, and we'll literally just import it. We'll import, no, we won't import all of that, but we'll import /pages/page. Okay? Now we get the component from this. So we'll say const component is just mod.default. It's the default export. And logically, we render it. HTML is here, so we'll just, instead of app, we will render the component. Just like that. Save. So now we're rendering the component to a string, and this kind of looks good. It's probably going to break because we changed the imports. So these need to become default imports. Okay? And now let's rerun it and see what this happens. Honestly, I kind of expected that. In breeds.tsx, we just have one erroneous import, so let's go fix that. It's .. TypeScript didn't catch that one. Okay, so now we're running on our server. You cannot get /. That's intentional because we have breeds now, and it works. We're still not fetching data, though. We kind of moved stuff around, but if we remove React on the client side, so I'm just going to delete that line, and run the server once more, what we see is we're not fetching data still, but we are getting the components, the right components on the server. The last thing to do is to fetch the components' data on the server. How do we do that? How do frameworks do that? Well, since we already have file system-based routing, we just need to take this fetch and give it to the server somehow. How we do that is by moving stuff around. So what we're going to do is copy this outside the React component into a function called, getStuff. Right? It's an async function, and it gets stuff. It returns a bunch of data. Okay? And what we'll do is we'll use it in useEffect as well. So we'll get stuff.then, and we'll set breeds. Lastly, we need to export that fetch to the server and call it on the server and get the initial data. To get initial data, we need initial data. So we'll say initial breeds as a prop, and we'll initialize set state with it. Lastly, we export a function called, get server-side props. We get props on the server side. Right? Why not? Oh, wow, cool, thanks, Copilot. And we just literally just return props. So in this case, initial breeds, whoa, infinity. Initial breeds is await get stuff. That's what we're doing. And then we give it to this. So that's our initial idea. I hope this makes sense so far. We just moved fetch outside so we can then do it on the server side. So what we're going to do now is get that. So if mod has get server-side props, then we call it. But first, let's initialize props. Props is nothing by default. And if it's defined, we do props is await get server-side props. We can pass in the request object just for fun. And now we render to string component, and we spread props. Save. Let's try. See what happens. Whoa, what happened here? Property initial breeds is okay, well, thank you, TypeScript. In fact, let's go to breeds and just initialize it here as a default. It's an array. TypeScript, God bless TypeScript. Okay, so now look at that. We are fetching this on there is no client-side bundle. Yeah, you can. And thank you. And so you notice this page is not even using React. There is no React. This is full server. And it wasn't that hard, right? If we confirm with a view source, we have all the data here. This is great because search engines can now pick it up. And our time to first byte is somewhat faster. Of course, the inside page doesn't fetch data. So let's actually fix that as well quickly. This is not going to be very, very complicated. So we're doing the same thing again. So we'll do a function outside const get stuff, right? It's an async function. It's an async function that gets stuff, and we return data.message. Okay, perfect. This is going to take an argument here. Breed is a string, and we'll just call that get stuff with breed. Look at that, perfect. And we don't need any of this. We just do set image. Since we're using server side, we don't actually even need client side loading states because we have initial data. And here we just need initial breed, initial image, and they're both strings by default, right? This looks pretty great. And what we're going to do now is use the initial values, so initial breed, initial image, and we'll export the same thing. We'll export get server side props, export const get server side props, async function, same drill. We return, come on, initial breed and initial image. We get the request object from which we can get the query string. So initial breed is query.b, and this is await get stuff query.b. This logically should work. Again, I haven't tested it before, so let's try. And if we reload, exactly, totally works. Again, just on the server side. So that's full. And again, we're not using React at all on the client side. There's one thing I need to fix, which is there's a go back that goes to slash. Let's just make this go to slash breeds for fun. And now we should have just a full navigation loop. So we go back. Wait. We go back, reload this, and now, perfect. So this is all fully server side. That's what frameworks do for you in terms of, so what we just did was we implemented routing, server routing, data fetching, and server-side rendering. So routing, fetching, rendering. This is what frameworks do. They do a whole bunch of other things, but this is kind of what they do. There's just one last issue with this, the way we're doing server rendering. Can anyone kind of identify? Let me show you the server code so you get it. So if we go look at the server, right? This is what this is what the server does. Can anyone identify a massive issue with this? No, we're not refreshing the page. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we're not becoming we're not hydrating on the client side. Indeed, that's correct, and we can actually fix that in our client by saying instead of render, we do, we can't. Never mind, ignore that, sorry. But the bigger problem is this. We're using render to string. And this is something framework authors need to deal with, and we don't, right? Render to string is an older, slower API that is not something you should use for server rendering. And I say that because it can be problematic in that it is synchronous. Meaning, if you have a very deep React tree, and it's very complex, it will render, it will turn that into a string, but it will do it synchronously, meaning it is not interruptible, it is not pausable, it cannot stop at suspense boundaries, things like this. And so one server, multiple clients. If client A requests your page and your server is busy rendering, then client B, C, D, E, they just have to wait. And if your app is very complex, render to string could probably crash your server. It could, like, it's a very delicate synchronous API, so it's great for small applications, but this is not going to scale. So we've implemented a framework. We can fix this at the framework level without any user code changes at all. The user code is our dog breed app. This is our framework. So how do we fix this? How do we use a newer asynchronous API? Render to pipeable stream. And what we're going to do is, instead of all of this, we have a new function called const. We get a value pipe, and we'll say render to pipeable stream. We give our app, which is our component. Whoa, this is actually very complicated. So what we're going to do is we'll pass in component, and we'll spread our props. Okay, and that's it. So we want to render this to a pipeable stream, and then we pipe this to the response. And it's a pipe, so it's asynchronous. So it gives us a bunch of benefits that we'll talk about. Lastly, we'll give it bootstrap scripts, and we'll say load this when you're ready. And it will then pick up the client-side JavaScript and become interactive as well. So this we only changed in framework land. We did not change this in user land. And if we go here, now there is some Unicode formatting. That's because I didn't add like an HTML element and so on that specifies the character set. But no change to user code, and everything works just as expected. Not only as expected, but now we also include React on the client side without any user changes at all. We've also opted into a streaming API, which means as soon as the first piece of DOM is ready, it just streamed to the client while other work can happen concurrently. Okay, we get all these benefits. We can now take advantage of suspense boundaries. And because it's a stream, it can be transformed, meaning you can send a bit of a stream to the user and then combine that with other streams, for example, from server components, etc. You get all these benefits without lifting a finger to change user code. This is why we need frameworks. Hope that's clear. So let's pivot. We're about to wrap up, but I do want to touch on the future, what frameworks will do. We just looked a little bit about what frameworks will do, and that is go from synchronous APIs to asynchronous APIs without any of our intervention. But let's talk about a little bit more towards the future, a little bit further out. That is React server components. They are enormously difficult to wire up yourself. And they give you benefits. A lot of people have trouble understanding or wrapping their head around the model of server components, but I think the best way to understand it is what we just did with the framework was we included the server, but only at the top level. We could do pages. The entire page is server generated. What if a component in your tree could be server generated? So it's just an increase in granularity. It includes the server at any point of your React tree, not just at the top. That is the benefit of server components. So you could say, I have a very problematic module where I import a lot of JavaScript, turn that into a server component. Server components are going to be more accessible primarily through frameworks. Indeed, they already are with Next.js, and this is another reason to use a framework. But before you go all in on server components, at this point in time, there are a few caveats you should be made aware of. Number one, they're not actually server components. The terminology is a little bit conflated, but they execute anywhere a Node.js server executes. This could even be on your local machine. You could use server components to generate a static site. So it's static, it's not serverful, technically. It's just, the terminology can be a little bit loaded, and I want to provide you with clarity and education. Number two, they require you to rethink your model of React. React has always been client first, but with the advent of server components, React is moving more towards a server-first direction. This isn't bad, necessarily. In fact, it's pretty good. But it does require some rethinking. A practical tip, so I've already given you, by the way, a practical tool you can take with you to work every day. And that is to start fetching data early. Remember we talked about that? Another practical tool to put yourself in the best position to adopt server components when they're mainstream is to rethink your interactivity model. So a lot of us have interactive components as part of a larger tree. And if you want to get the most out of server components the soonest, what you're going to want to do is take the interactive pieces out of your tree and make them their own module. So you'll have tiny components. This is just a button. That's it. This is just a click. This is just a link. So if you move the interactive stuff to its own component, you'll be well placed to take advantage of server components because this divide is going to happen. And if you put yourself ahead of that, it'll benefit you. Number three, server components are pretty hard to take advantage of today without a framework because they need like a next generation of tooling that doesn't exist today. They need a next generation bundler. For example, you need something like Webpack or Rollup to understand, oh, this is a client component. Okay, I'll put it in the client bundle. Oh, this is a server component. I'll put it in it needs to like generate different types of bundles and respond to different types of code. It just doesn't exist. Similarly, a server-side router that is not a server rendering router, but a client to a server component route. There's a lot of tooling that you need that doesn't exist today that is being worked on. Hydration, that is the process of picking up on the client where the server left off, is something that is pretty hard with server components because you cannot for example, hydrate just the client things. There's work being done there, but you need to download the entire app from the server before you make it interactive, still, even with server components. Server components introduces a type of directive. Like in JavaScript, we have use strict at the top as a string. Server components introduces use client for components that are only supposed to be interactive. These are non-standard JavaScript things, they're React things, and I think it's important that you know the difference. Fetch in Next.js is not browser fetch. It's a patched fetch. And it's important that you know the difference so that you learn JavaScript and React separate and don't confuse them for the same thing. You cannot do context with server components on the server side, but another practical tip and a takeaway for you is to use server-side caching as context. The problem is, with client apps, the context is unique to your client. With one server that services many clients, you can't have shared context across all your clients. So server-side caching, namespaced by user ID, is a way around this. And lastly, the future. Frameworks enable the future and the future of server components. With that, I pose the question, does everybody indeed need to use a framework? The answer is the classic engineering answer, I feel like, right? You probably should. If you don't, you'll end up accidentally creating your own and it's not going to be as good. But it really does depend. If you're making an application only for like internal stuff that doesn't really hurt from client only, sure. If you're a consultancy that does these types of things, that's fine. But to close and to wrap up, we covered a tremendous amount of content today. We built a framework. What? And we understand what frameworks do for us. We looked at the terminology of library versus framework versus meta framework. We looked at data fetching, server rendering, and routing from the server side. And we looked at React server components and what the future holds. We did cover a lot of content, and if it was a little bit hard to keep up with, the videos will be out as well. If you're learning from the content, I've got more of this stuff on YouTube. I'd invite you to subscribe to the channel and stay in touch. I'd love to hear from you. But with that, React Next, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.